things that didn't happen.
Thank you. So this is the problem we get to every time one of these people on the left demands some change in the law. It comes down to the question of, well, what difference can you point out to me a law that would have made a difference? And so far I haven't come across one. I've asked John Henderson and Ron McCain from the Range St. Louis West to come in today and sit in the studio with me because there's been a lot of talk about these bump stocks or people buying large numbers of semi-automatic weapons, rifles specifically, and whether or not that should be legal. Gentlemen, welcome into the program.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
thanks, Mark.
You bet. What about these bump? Let's talk about these bump stocks. I mean, I don't know that I've ever even seen one. I can't imagine needing one personally, but they're not illegal. Is that? I mean, you can legally purchase them now, right?
That's correct. Bump stocks really came about 3-4 years ago.
Okay.
And basically, you replace the stock on a semi-automatic rifle, and they make them for different models. And basically, that uses the gun's recoil to fire the second, third, fourth shot, so you're not having to actually pull the trigger with your finger. Your finger has to be on the trigger. It won't. You can't just pull the trigger and hold it down and it fire. But if used the way it's designed, it does simulate full auto fire.
But I mean, in that I have not seen one of these in action. If you fire it once and it's firing the next shot based on the recoil, wouldn't it just keep firing until the magazine was empty?
It will, as long as you're using it correctly. There's a little bit of you can't just pull the trigger. You've got to hold the gun a certain way to make it operate properly.
You know, I've been obviously to the range many times. One time when I was there, I think we had what looked like an Uzi 9mm auto that you let me fire on the range. For people that have never fired one of those, you're generally not firing for accuracy if you're on full auto, because I think you warned me that time you gotta watch this because it's going to ride up as soon as you pull that trigger.
That's correct. Full auto fire is not accurate fire. Full auto fire, typically in the military, as far as personal weapons are concerned, squad weapons are used for suppressive fire. They're not used for an individual target. You cannot control a full auto firearm that you're holding very readily unless you've been properly trained to do so.
You know, I've heard the argument, and you might have heard that guy say it there. He wants to see a ban on these bump stocks. And what Tucker Carlson followed up with was a good point. Would that have prevented what happened in Las Vegas? And the answer I come to with all of those for more stringent background checks or a longer waiting period or doing away with bump stocks, this guy bought his weapons legally. The bump stocks are legal at least for now, but even if he hadn't had one, if you just pull the trigger fast enough, you're still going to get a number of shots off. And they said he had some 100-round magazines with him. What's your reaction when you hear arguments like that?
Well, that's typical of the anti-gun crowd, and they follow the philosophy of never let a good tragedy go to waste to further their agenda. And when it comes down to it, it doesn't matter if it was a semi-auto hunting rifle or the bump stock. If someone's intent on hurting and killing people, they're going to do it. I mean, my immediate comeback to it would be, well, we should make murder illegal.
Well, it is, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and yet he still did it. So evil people do evil things regardless. I mean, people drive drunk all the time. You know, we lose 35,000 people a year in the U.S. to automobile accidents, but there's never a call to ban automobiles. The attack in France in Nice, the driver of that truck killed 86 people with a truck. There was never a call to ban delivery trucks in France because you can't regulate, as the governor of Kentucky said, you can't regulate evil. We have to do everything in our society to make sure that evil people don't do bad things. And that's why we have laws and existing laws that do all this. Buying a firearm legally in America is one of the most regulated things you can do.
Sure.
And so there's already dozens of laws were broken for him to do what he did already. Is another law or two going to change that?
No. And particularly in this case where this guy didn't have any sort of criminal background at all. There was nothing to prevent him from buying these weapons. Ron, maybe you can answer this. I heard somebody say this report on the network news this morning that if somebody buys 2 or more weapons, handguns at a time, that sets off some sort of trigger for the ATF. Is that correct?
Well, as an FFL dealer, if an individual purchases 2 or more handguns within a 5-day period, so they could buy a gun on Monday and buy another gun on Wednesday, they would still fall under this same regulation. We are required to provide a copy of the 4473 background check and a specific form with their name on it to the ATF and to our local law enforcement so that they know an individual purchased more than one handgun within a 5-day period.
So I guess it's up to the police then to follow up on that. Say it's September at the range, which you guys just finished up, where you had, great deals and $100 off on 6-hour handguns, and somebody wanted a 9mm and a 45. That would trigger that, even though there was no ill intent there. Would you support that sort of thing for semi-automatic long rifles? I mean, somebody suggested that on the news this morning. Well, if they're doing a check, if they're flagging handgun sales, why wouldn't they flag multiple long gun purchases?
And again, would that law have prevented this or any other tragedy?
No, we started last June buying a bunch of guns, right?
That's exactly the point. So we're in this mode of trying to ban an object or a tool rather than deal with the culture that creates a situation where this person thought that this was the answer to whatever the question was. And that's the issue, whether it's the violence that goes on every week in Chicago. And if we look at Chicago on a annual basis, far more people are killed in the city of Chicago every year, but yet that goes just undocumented.
Sure.
There's no cry for any change there. And Chicago is one of the hardest places in the country to get a firearm. So there's 330 million privately owned firearms in this country, Mark. If guns were the issue, the violence associated with guns would be a lot higher.
Yeah.
If the guns were causing. It's the fact that we have a culture that some people are willing to inflict violence, whether it's with a bat, a knife, a fist, or a gun on another human being. That's the problem that we have to solve. It's a cultural issue. It's not an access to a tool issue.
Yeah. And in terms of, the background checks and some of the other things that have been talked about, I saw them interview the guy at one of the stores in Utah where this guy apparently bought one or more of these weapons. And you guys must, I don't know how often it's ever happened that somebody's committed a crime with a gun and the police have had to come in and say, did such and such buy a gun here? Or they've traced it back to your store, whatever the case may be. Is there, I've heard people go so far as to say that they should put the onus back on you to try to screen people who are in there buying guns. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Absolutely. I just continue to equate it to the fact that rather than deal with the real problem, let's identify something that's tenable, something that we can put our finger on and attack that. And that's what's happening in the firearm industry. The real problem isn't the gun. It's, just like John said, we have societal issues. I would love to live in a world where I got up every morning and I slid down the rainbow to my pot of gold and ate cotton candy all day. But the truth is that that's not the world that we live in, and there are people that are not going to abide by our laws. They look for opportunities to take advantage of other people, and that's not going to go away.
So, Mark, I grew up in a rural environment in Tennessee, as you can tell from the accent, and it was extremely common for guys to drive to school with a shotgun and a deer rifle hanging in the back of the truck.
Sure.
We still got in fights. We still had disagreements. As a matter of fact, I carried a pocket knife through my entire time in high school. And the principal knew everybody carried a pocket knife. You know how many stabbings we had the whole 4 years I was in high school? 0. It didn't happen. If you had a disagreement, you may get in a fight. You would never dream of pulling out your knife and using it on the guy. So we've degraded to a point that we have a cultural issue. It doesn't remove firearms from the equation. We're still in this cultural issue. And further regulation of something that's one of the most heavily regulated products in the country is not the answer. And we already do self-police. We have numerous times refused to sell a firearm to someone because they were inebriated or they had been engaging in use of illegal drugs based on our opinion, or we just didn't feel comfortable with it. And sometimes that results in we've been responsible at the range for saving people's lives because they had ill intent with that firearm on themselves. And we do that all the time. If we feel uneasy about it, we get somebody else or a couple other people to come talk to that person and try to figure out, is this just me or is there really something going on? I've escorted people out of the building before because they're coming in and they're drunk and want to shoot a gun. So if you look at FFL dealers' ranges across the country, we give far more scrutiny to our customer base than any other industry in the country. And so we already do all those things they say we should do and we should force you to do. We already do it. We do it because it's the right thing to do, not because there's a regulation that says we have to do it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Are you worried, representing the industry here for a moment, that there's going to be some sort of knee-jerk legislation that comes out of this?
I know there's going to be a push, Ron. Ron and I talked about this earlier. I think the legislation that was in the works for changing how silencers are regulated, I think that's dead now. That won't happen, certainly not this year. But there'll be some push. There'll be legislation introduced, but I don't think anything will come to fruition. At least I hope not, because that would mean Republicans and the president both are on board with that.
Well, certainly I think you'll see an attack on magazine capacity again. I think you'll see the bump stock issue come up, and I think expanding on that, likely they'll look into like a binary trigger, whether or not that would be continue to be a legal item to have. So obviously, there are those that are going to use this tragedy to try to further their political agenda.
Sure.
And firearm is going to be the topic.
Well, on the issue of the silencer or the suppressor for a minute, somebody made the point yesterday that you couldn't have used one of those because of the heat on one of those rifles that he was using anyway, correct? So Hillary Clinton and these other people bringing that up as an issue right now is kind of irrelevant.
Well, you can use a silencer on a true full auto weapon. It does create a lot of heat, and you can actually melt a silencer if you had continued full automatic fire. And there's videos online that you can see of somebody actually purposely doing that to see how many rounds it takes. But you need to understand, a silencer is not a silencer. That's the term the government uses. That's the legal term. The scientific term is suppressor. So it doesn't get rid of the noise associated with a gunshot. It suppresses it to a certain extent. There's two noises when a gun is fired: the explosion from the round actually going off, and if it's a supersonic round, which most rifles are, there's also a sonic boom. So even though a suppressor will reduce that explosion noise, it does nothing to mitigate the sonic boom, because that occurs outside of the firearm itself. So a suppressor is not like in the movies, like you were talking about the other day.
James Bond movie.
Yeah, and that's it. Yeah, that's not how it sounds. It does make it less. In this case, again, he wasn't even using a silencer. So, I mean, I guess maybe we should have a discussion about regulating law rocket launchers, because if he'd have used one of those, he could have killed even more people, right? I mean,
right.
So it's a false argument to even bring that up when it wasn't even part of the equation to begin with. We could pick any other weapon. We could pick anything. And, what if he'd have drove a box truck through the concert instead of using a rifle? I mean, it's a false argument. Well,
it's a good point. Gentlemen, I've run out of time. We could talk about this all day. John Henderson, Ron McCain from the Range St. Louis West, TheRangeSTL.com. Listen to their show, which is Downrange, which is on every Saturday right after Annie Fry's show at 7 o'clock.
I appreciate it, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Keep up the good work.
Yeah, gentlemen, thank you for coming in and explaining a lot of that. I do appreciate that. Got to get to a break. 314-969.